Okay, let's unpack this. If you are involved in building anything, a skyscraper, a highway, a massive software system, or, even launching a major corporate initiative, you start with a contract.
Right.
And that contract is supposed to be the foundational document, the blueprint for
It's
certainty.
supposed to be, yeah.
But the moment that ink is dry, the race against the inevitable starts. Changes, delays, and eventually the painful process of formal disputes or claims.
That's the core conflict of construction, really. The contract promises this static, predictable future, but the physical reality of building is just inherently messy and dynamic.
So what are we using as our guide here?
Our sources for this deep dive are technical lecture notes. They're used in advanced procurement and contract management courses. So basically, these are the rules of engagement for professionals who have to manage that chaos.
We are diving into the dense, crucial world of construction contract change management. It sounds like something you'd find buried in an HR manual, maybe a little dry.
A little, yeah.
But this is the arena where millions of dollars are won or lost, and ultimately where projects succeed or, well, utterly fail. If you want a shortcut to understanding how the industry formalizes the messy reality of execution and allocates risk, you're in the right place.
Our mission here is to give you a structural blueprint, a single narrative that follows a deviation from start to finish. We'll cover the full life cycle,
The whole thing.
the whole thing, from how an unforeseen event becomes a formal change order, to how that change impacts the schedule, creating delays, and finally, how parties seek financial resolution through claims and damages. It's a roadmap to surviving and hopefully thriving when things inevitably go sideways.
Let's start with the absolute fundamentals. In construction, we can't just use the regular definition of change, just doing something differently. How does the industry formally define and categorize these necessary deviations?
Right. In contract language, the definition is very tightly controlled. It has to be to trigger all the contractual rights and responsibilities.
Makes sense.
So construction contract changes are defined as any modification, addition, or deletion that is explicitly directed by the owner and authorized under the contract document.
Okay, so both of those have to be true. The client has to instruct it, and the contract has to allow for it.
Exactly. It needs those two criteria. So if the contractor decides on their own to use a higher grade of steel, that's not a formal contract change.
Even if it's a better idea, an improvement.
Doesn't matter. It has to come from the top. And that distinction allows us to separate a change from an extra.
Okay, so how are they different?
Extras are additional work, also directed by the owner, but they are specifically work that is not within the original scope of work. A change might adjust the existing parameters like substituting one material for another. An extra expands the scope entirely.
Like adding a fifth floor that was never in the original drawings.
That's a perfect example. That's an extra.
That makes the financial impact of changes sound like simple scope creep. But the sources emphasize this disruptive reality. They use the term ripple effects.
Oh.
What are those practical consequences on the ground?
Oh, the disruption is massive. It's because the contractor based their entire bid and their entire schedule on a really detailed, orderly sequence.
Right.
They plan to pour concrete on Tuesday, install the HVAC ductwork on Wednesday, and so on. Any alteration, a change, or an extra forces them to pause, re-engineer, and re-estimate everything.
And that disruption, that lost efficiency, and the ripple effect on all the downstream activities,
Yeah.
that's often more costly than the physical cost of the change itself.
That's what kills budgets. Exactly. Suddenly moving activity A pushes back activities B, C, and D, requiring them to bring crews back later, or even, having to pay people to sit idle.
And this certainty of disruption is why projects need to budget for it up front.
Absolutely. Depending on the complexity and the inherent risk of the project, say, a highly specialized facility versus a simple warehouse, the source materials indicate that a change order contingency of anywhere between 3% and 10% of the total project budget should be considered.
And that's not money you hope to save, right? It's money you fully expect to spend.
It's money you budget to manage the unavoidable turbulence.
Yeah. So since change is certain, the industry has formalized the process into what we call change management. How did the professionals standardize this chaos?
Change management is fundamentally about control and documentation. It's the structured process of formally requesting, evaluating, and approving changes to the project scope, deliverables, timescales, or resources before that change is actually implemented in the field.
It's an administrative shield against disaster.
That's a good way to put it. And the sources lay out a 5-stage sequence for managing that change at the project level, which gives us a great strategic framework.
Okay, let's walk through it.
It's very logical. First, you formulate change. That's just identifying the need and the proposed solution. Second, you plan change. And this is the critical step of assessing the impact on cost, time, and quality.
Right, the what-if analysis.
Exactly. Third, you implement change, actually executing the revised scope. Fourth, manage transition, integrating the alteration back into the main ongoing workflow as smoothly as you can.
I find that final step particularly insightful. Sustain change. It seems to acknowledge that a change isn't just a one-off action, it's a new, steady state.
It is. You haven't truly managed the change until you ensure the team stops revisiting the issue, the documentation is updated, and the project continues forward effectively under the new parameters.
And this formal framework applies to every type of change, which I see we generally categorize as either elective or required.
Correct. Let's distinguish those. Elective change is what it sounds like. It's a strategic choice.
Proactive.
Yes, it's a proactive decision. It emerges from the need to improve things, maybe through a value management exercise to find a cheaper or better way, or maybe because market forces shift, making the original plan suboptimal. You choose to make the alteration for a perceived benefit,
Versus a required change.
which is the result of an unforeseen event. This is the unexpected, like discovering toxic soil, a major regulatory update that forces a redesign, or a clash between two separate design packages that forces an alteration.
So one is proactive improvement, the other is reactive problem solving.
Exactly. And to manage all of this, the process requires, well, intense administrative organization. The sources mention specific tools, even referencing methodologies like Prince2.
Which relies on things like the change control approach, configuration item record, and issue register.
Right. And the core takeaway there isn't the name of the methodology, but the meticulous need for documentation. In the construction world, especially when you're dealing with claims, if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen.
The paper trail is everything.
Everything. Every change must be logged, tracked against the plan configuration, that's the configuration item record, and reported daily. This robust paper trail is the contractor's first line of defense later on when delays accumulate and the finger-pointing begins.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the source material is very direct about the consequences. Changes are the leading cause of cost overruns and delays. It's not just a fact of life, it's a failure of initial execution.
And that structural failure almost always points back to the initial planning process, particularly involving the owner or the design team. When we look at the common reasons for changes on building works, we see a pattern of information deficit and communication breakdown.
Inadequate briefing from the client is always high on that list. If the client doesn't know what they want or can't articulate it, the design is just doomed to revisions.
Absolutely. Followed closely by inconsistent and late instructions from that same client. The owner is often still deciding on finishes, equipment, or use requirements long after the design was supposed to be frozen.
But the design team takes a lot of responsibility here too. Incomplete design or lack of meticulous planning at the design stage. If the details aren't worked out on paper, they will be worked out in the field at 10 times the cost.
Oh, at least. And that lack of coordination of specialist design work, that's a huge one. When you have 5 different engineering firms working on the structure, mechanical systems, and the facade and their drawings clash.
That clash becomes a required change order on site, a very expensive one.
And finally, late clarification of complex details. These gaps turn into required changes in the field, which leads us to this concept of integrated change control.
This sounds like the overarching philosophy of managing the whole process.
It is. The Project Management Institute defines integrated change control as the essential process for controlling the factors that create changes in the first place. It's a mechanism to ensure 2 things happen. First, that only beneficial changes are approved. And second, that there is a rigorous system to determine whether a change has actually occurred. The process minimizes negative changes, maximizes beneficial controlled ones, and most importantly, ensures the ripple effect is contained.
The structural driver behind all these formal rules is uncertainty. We establish that certainty is a myth, so uncertainty is a reality we have to manage. How do we define it in contract management?
Uncertainty is defined as issues difficult to reasonably predict or that are simply unknown during the initial planning phase. But the most insightful definition from the sources frames it as an information gap.
An information gap.
Yeah, the difference between the total amount of information required to successfully perform a task and the amount of information you already have available when the contract is signed.
So if you need 100 data points to execute a design and you only have 70, you have 30 points of uncertainty debt. That makes it almost quantifiable.
It does. And that debt isn't just about missing facts, it's multidimensional. Uncertainties can be information related, like missing data, time based, like schedule volatility, and even ambition related, so vague client goals. They deal with complexity, risk, opportunity, ambiguity, all of it.
We can't eliminate that information gap entirely, so we have to shift to mitigating it.
Yeah.
The sources list 4 highly proactive interventions to handle this unavoidable uncertainty.
The first one is absorbing uncertainty. This is the financial tactic.
Right, the contingency we talked about.
Exactly. Making specific provisions, like that 10% contingency, to financially absorb the expected changes. You allocate money and time buffers, accepting that turbulence is coming and paying for a mechanism to absorb the shock.
The second is dividing splitting. This makes sense, especially for projects with new technology or sites with extreme unknowns.
Totally. If a project involves extremely high uncertainty, say drilling an entirely new type of tunnel or building a facility with untested manufacturing methods, you break the project into smaller, manageable packages.
And tackle the riskiest bit first.
You tackle the riskiest package first. This minimizes the effect of one uncertain component on the overall mission and allows you to learn and adjust before committing fully.
Then we have postponing. This sounds counterintuitive to good management, but in certain contexts, it's the most pragmatic choice.
It's pragmatism over precision. Postponing involves using provisional sums or quantities when specifications, estimates, or quantities are genuinely ambiguous.
So instead of forcing a hard estimate based on bad information, which just guarantees a painful change order later,
Right. You set aside a provisional amount and you defer the final specification and costing until more information naturally surfaces later in the project lifecycle.
so you say, I know I need a specialized pump, but I don't know the exact flow rate requirements yet, so I'll budget X dollars provisionally and finalize the type in 6 months.
That's it exactly. And finally, transferring uncertainty. This is all about shifting the risk to the party better equipped to handle it.
This feels like a key insight into modern contract strategy.
It really changes the entire dynamic. For instance, moving from a traditional design bid build contract, where the owner carries the risk of design errors and coordination problems.
To something like a design build DB or build operate transfer BOT system.
Precisely. By using design build, you transfer the risk associated with design completeness and coordination to the contractor. They are now responsible for coordinating all those specialist design works we mentioned earlier. It's a formal, upfront risk allocation strategy that reduces the likelihood of owner-caused change orders.
Okay, we've established that changes are inevitable, and we have a strategic framework for managing the uncertainty they spring from. Now, let's get specific. What are the specific legal flavors of change we need to recognize, especially the ones that lead directly to litigation?
The sources categorize changes first by scope. Are they within scope like, resolving a conflict in existing design documents, or beyond scope, out of scope, which is clearly an extra, like adding more square footage.
Right.
But the legal taxonomy gets more nuanced when we look at how the change violates the contract.
Let's talk about the big one, cardinal change. That sounds catastrophic.
It can be. A cardinal change is a fundamental alteration, so major, so far beyond the original intent of the contract, that it's often considered a material breach of the original agreement.
So the change order process exists to manage minor deviations, but this is something else entirely.
Exactly. If the owner asks you to suddenly build a bridge instead of a parking garage, you could argue a cardinal change occurred. That means the original contract, scope, and price may no longer apply, and you are entitled to be compensated for entirely new work under different legal principles.
That's the contractor essentially saying, you didn't just change the blueprint, you asked me to build a rocket instead of a house. The old contract is dead.
That's a great way to put it. Then you have constructive change. This one is key because it's an implied change.
Implied, so it wasn't written down.
It occurs due to an owner's action or inaction, even if they never issued a formal piece of paper. For example, if the owner demands a higher quality of finish than the specification calls for, insisting on 6 coats of paint when the contract specified 3, that action constructively changes the amount of work required.
So the contractor has to do it, but they can recover the cost later.
They have to perform the work, but yes, they're entitled to recover the cost. That owner's behavior forced them to spend more time and money, even without a formal order.
What about issues rooted in the plans themselves?
That brings in defective specifications and misrepresentations. If the plans or data provided were fundamentally flawed, forcing a redesign. A related concept is differing site condition, when the physical conditions you find on site, like unforeseen bedrock or contaminated groundwater, are materially different from what was represented or reasonably expected.
And these all trigger claims.
Every time. We also include oral changes, extra work, which are notoriously difficult to prove, and disputes over the interpretation of ambiguous documents.
So regardless of the cause, from a minor design error to a differing site condition, the change has to be formalized to proceed. That instrument is the change order.
Correct. A change order is the written instruction, ideally agreed upon by all parties, directing the contractor to make the change. And if we use the American Institute of Architects, or AIA, contract documents as a common industry standard, we see three basic formal types of instruments.
And they represent different levels of agreement and control.
Exactly. Let's start with the best case.
The gold standard.
The standard formal change order. This is it. It's signed by both the owner and the contractor. It establishes mutual consent on the scope modification, the time extension, and the cost adjustment. Negotiations are done, work proceeds cleanly.
But what if the owner needs the modification immediately? Maybe a structural element needs reinforcement, but the parties are still arguing over whether the cost adjustment should be $50,000 or $75,000.
That is the exact purpose of the Construction Change Directive, CCD. This is a mechanism for the owner to essentially pull the emergency stop button on negotiations. It is signed only by the owner.
So the contractor's signature isn't required.
It's not. And that forces the contractor to proceed with the change immediately while negotiations over price and time are ongoing.
That is a powerful tool. It allows the owner to protect the schedule, but it requires the contractor to trust that they will eventually get an equitable adjustment.
It definitely transfers financial risk, at least temporarily. The contractor must proceed, their costs are tracked, and the final price is determined later. The third, simpler category is the field order.
For minor things.
For genuinely minor changes,
Yeah.
like adjusting a door swing, something that does not affect the time or cost of the project. If time or cost is impacted, it has to escalate to a change order or a CCD.
Beyond the AIA classification, change orders are also categorized by the number of required signatures: unilateral, bilateral, and multilateral.
A unilateral change order is one where a single party has the right to make a change without the explicit agreement of the other.
How does that work?
Usually because that right was explicitly reserved in the original contract. It's often used for calling up specific allowances or minor adjustments that don't fundamentally alter the agreed risk. Notification is still required, but agreement is not.
So the unilateral order is about reserved rights, a pre-agreed action.
Then you have the bilateral change order, which requires the agreement of two contracting parties, typically owner and contractor. This is the common, formalized change order we just discussed, where mutual consent establishes the new parameters. It's the standard way of doing business.
And the rare, complex beast, multilateral.
A multilateral change order requires the agreement of three or more contracting parties or stakeholders. This usually happens on massive infrastructure projects where the owner, the general contractor, and perhaps a major financing institution, a government regulator, or a significant third-party stakeholder must all sign off before the change can be executed.
That sounds like it adds a lot of time to the approval process.
A huge amount of time. But it spreads the risk among all the interested parties.
When a change occurs, we call the resulting adjustment a variation in the scope. The final, crucial step is valuation. How do we put a price tag on a variation?
First, a variation constitutes changes in a few key areas: the scope of works, changes in the levels, dimensions, or positioning, changes in the materials, workmanship, or quality, or changes in the order of precedence of contract documents.
So if you adjust the size of the building, the type of window, or the sequence of operations, it's a variation.
It's a variation, and the pricing methods are highly formalized to prevent arguments.
What are they?
The sources outlined 4 standard valuation methods, ranked from most preferable to least. The simplest is by agreement. The parties just negotiate and mutually accept the cost. It's fast, cheap, and minimizes disputes.
But if you can't agree on a price, you fall back to the existing contractual rates.
That's the second method. You calculate the variation at contract rates, bill of quantities rates, or schedule rates. If the variation involves performing more of an item already priced in the contract, say additional excavation, you just apply the unit rate you already agreed upon.
What if the work is entirely new, like adding a bespoke feature that was never priced?
That leads to method 3, valuing the work as day work. This is essentially open book accounting. The contractor tracks the actual labor hours, material costs, and equipment hours spent on the new work. usually with predefined markups for overhead and profit.
So it's the ultimate tally of actual cost incurred.
It is, and if none of those fit, the fallback is valuation at reasonable rates. This is used when the work is new, day work isn't feasible, and the parties can't agree. It relies on fair market value or expert judgment to determine a reasonable cost.
Which sounds like it could easily lead to adjudication or litigation.
It often does if the party's definition of reasonable differs significantly.
A variation or change order rarely comes without a time penalty. This brings us to delays. We need to clearly separate a simple delay from a time overrun, which carries much higher stakes.
Right. A delay simply means a task happens later than expected. Time overruns, however, occur when the cumulative effect of multiple delays pushes the actual completion time beyond the original contract time.
And this is where liquidated damages kick in.
Exactly. A delay to a non-critical activity might be annoying, but an overrun delays the grand opening.
This highlights the importance of the critical path. If an activity is delayed, you have to immediately ask, does this delay the project completion date?
Immediately. And the contract time is rigorously calculated. The agreed completion time, let's call it decomp, accounts for the handover date of the site, time for mobilization, the original contract time, plus two crucial additions: time for justified delay and time for supplementary works.
And if the actual completion date is later than that formalized decomp, then you have an overrun.
You have an overrun.
Now we get to the core of risk allocation. Every delay must be categorized along 4 dimensions to determine liability and compensation. This is where contracts live or die.
The first dimension is critical or non-critical. Does the delay impact the overall critical path? If it does, it's critical. If the activity has flute time, it can slip without affecting the end date. It's non-critical, and the delay is usually contained.
Second, excusable or non-excusable. This focuses on accountability.
Excusable delays are events that neither party could prevent by exercising due diligence. These include acts of God or force majeure war, fire, flood, extraordinary weather, or owner-caused events.
And for these, the contractor may be granted a time extension, but not necessarily money.
Exactly. They are excused from a consequence of being late. So an excusable delay buys you time.
And unacceptable delays.
Non-excusable delays. These are purely within the contractor's control. Poor resource allocation, late material delivery, inadequate staffing, subcontractor failures. For these, the contractor gets neither a time extension nor compensation. They have to accelerate or pay liquidated damages.
That brings us to the third dimension: compensable or non-compensable. This is where the money is decided.
Compensable delays are those that entitle the contractor to both a time extension and monetary compensation. These are almost always caused by owner actions: changes, neglect, failure to cooperate, errors in providing information or access.
So if the owner causes it, the owner pays for the time and the extended costs.
That's the rule, and the distinction between non-compensable and excusable is vital. Non-compensable delays are justifiable, meaning they are excusable, granting a time extension, but they do not include cost compensation. The classic examples are those force majeure events.
So you get the time extension because you couldn't prevent the hurricane, but you bear the cost of your extended general conditions yourself.
You got it. Finally, the most complex category: concurrent or non-concurrent. What happens when both parties are at fault simultaneously?
This sounds messy.
It is. Concurrent delays occur simultaneously, running in parallel. For example, the owner delays foundation access by 3 weeks due to permitting issues, but at the same time, the contractor is delayed by 2 weeks on steel fabrication due to poor subcontractor management.
How do courts and contracts typically untangle those simultaneous faults?
It's notoriously difficult, but a key rule often applies. Only the longest delay will generally be considered for time extension purposes.
Okay.
So if the contractor caused a 3-week delay while the owner was simultaneously causing a 5-week delay, the net time impact is the 5-week delay. And what's more, compensation gets complicated. Many jurisdictions rule that if the contractor is responsible for any part of a concurrent delay, the contractor is only entitled to the time extension, not the monetary compensation for that overlap period.
When the schedule slips, the costs are real and measurable for the owner. We need to look at those consequences.
For a private owner, the main damages are direct economic losses. Loss of revenues through lack of production capacity, inability to rent space, or the continuing cost of dependence on old facilities. They can calculate the hard dollars lost per day the facility isn't operational.
And if it's a public facility like a new school or hospital, the cost is to the community.
For a public owner, absolutely. The damage is often defined by lost public service and utility. The facility isn't available for use, and service revenues like road tolls or utility fees that were lost through delay can often never be recovered.
And the list of costs an owner might claim is huge.
It's vast. Continued inspection and design costs, staff costs, maintaining current facilities longer, lost revenue, and crucial financial costs like escalation costs and financing costs on the project loan.
On the flip side, the contractor incurs losses for unexcused delay. But if the delay is compensable caused by the owner, what exactly are they entitled to recover?
They are entitled to additional compensation for actual direct field cost excesses. This covers the hard costs of being on site longer than expected.
So extended field costs, idle labor, and equipment charges.
Exactly. And higher costs for materials if market escalation occurred during the delay. They are typically granted time extensions for force majeure events.
And a crucial point, when contractors claim for these compensable delays, they typically recover the cost, but are granted no allowance for profit on those extended costs.
Correct. The goal is recovery of incurred expense, not profit on the delay itself. But this brings us to the most practical, high-stakes rule in this entire deep dive.
The notification requirement.
Yes. You mentioned a very short window for notification. This is the difference between getting paid and eating the cost entirely.
It is critical for survival and claims management.
Delay claims, whether seeking compensation or time extensions, must be provided to the owner's site manager in writing within 48 hours of the start of the delay.
48 hours, that is incredibly fast.
And that notice must include supporting evidence and a revised schedule. That means the contractor can't wait until Friday to report something that happened Monday morning. If they miss that deadline, even if the owner was clearly at fault, their entitlement can be nullified.
Wow. So the process can trump the facts.
Precisely. The industry demands real-time awareness and prompt, formal documentation. If a pipe bursts on Tuesday and the contractor only sends a detailed claim package the following week, the owner can legally deny the claim on procedural grounds alone. The clock starts ticking immediately.
If that change event, with its subsequent time impact, cannot be resolved amicably, it turns into a claim. How is a claim formally defined, and what are its boundaries?
A claim is a formal request for compensation, either time or money due to or believed to be owed by one party to another for damages or losses. Claims arise when obligations aren't satisfied and a party seeks a contractual or legal remedy.
And these claims are often divided into those rooted inside the contract and those based on broader legal principles.
That's right. Contractor claim types inside the contract are based on express or implied terms, usually claims for extension of time, additional cost, or both. These align with specific clauses, whether they are variations or formally named events like the relevant events under UK-based JCT contracts or compensation events under NEC contracts.
We often hear those contract names, JCT, and in ACA circles. For someone unfamiliar, why are these contract standards relevant here?
They are simply different families of contract that formalize risk allocation across different geographic regions or industries. For example, JCT, which is common in the UK, lists specific relevant events that automatically trigger the entitlement to a time extension, like exceptionally adverse weather or civil commotion.
But the principle is the same across all of them.
The principle is the same. The claim must reference a specific clause that promises a remedy.
And the claims outside the contract.
They operate under broader legal umbrellas, such as claims under tort, which is civil wrongs, misrepresentation, false statements that induce the contract frustration, where an unforeseeable event makes the contract impossible, and relevant statutes. These often occur in those cardinal change scenarios where the contract itself is effectively broken.
Clearly, settling these demands an extremely high level of expertise.
It requires a highly specialized knowledge set that goes way beyond basic construction. You need knowledge of construction technology, construction law, deep familiarity with project planning systems, and programming techniques like critical path method.
And absolute contractual awareness.
Yes, understanding the conditions of contract administration, and the ability to negotiate effectively.
Claims often revolve around three related but distinct consequences of delays: disruption, prolongation, and acceleration. Let's delineate them, as their financial remedies differ completely.
Let's start with disruption. Disruption occurs if a contractor is prevented from carrying out work in accordance with an approved program, which means the contractor is forced to work in an inefficient manner or illogical sequence.
So the contractor is still on site, still working, but their productivity is just plummeted.
Exactly. They can't access areas or follow their planned flow. This is a claim for lost efficiency.
So, disruption is lost productivity on site. You're working for $100, but only achieving $50 worth of work due to the chaos caused by the owner.
That's a great way to put it. Next is prolongation. This is simpler. It is a delay to a critical activity that specifically extends the time for completion of the whole works.
Okay.
If this is not the contractor's fault, they get an extension of time and they claim the additional costs associated with that extended contract period, such as extended general conditions and site running costs. This is a claim for lost time.
So disruption covers the costs incurred during the original planned period due to chaos, and prolongation covers the fixed costs of having to stay on site longer than planned.
You've got it. Precisely. Finally, acceleration. This is remedial. It arises when the contractor claims they had to mobilize additional resources, extra shifts, weekend work, overtime, to complete the works within the current time of completion.
And this is typically because the owner caused an excusable delay but refused to grant a necessary time extension.
Yes. The contractor is forced to speed up to hit the original deadline.
In that situation, the contractor is entitled to compensation for those added resources, the cost of the overtime and extra crews, if the underlying delay was justified and compensable.
That's the definition of constructive acceleration. The sources tie acceleration directly to remedial rights for non-performance. Time extension is a provision for justified time delays. Acceleration is required when projects need to be completed before the current revised contract completion time, usually under duress from the owner. And when it's justified, the contractor is entitled to the compensation necessary to achieve that speed up.
If you file a claim for prolongation, you can't just say we were 5 weeks late. You have to prove two things: that the delay happened, and that it was critical, meaning it delayed the final project date. This demands sophisticated delay analysis.
This is where we move from administration to forensics. Delay analysis is necessary to demonstrate entitlement to an extension of time, or EOT, which means relief from liquidated damages, and to demonstrate entitlement to the costs of prolongation.
And these methods are classified based on when they're performed.
Right. Prospective analysis happens before the event, forecasting the impact. But in claims litigation, we rely primarily on retrospective analysis, looking backward.
Okay, let's focus on the retrospective techniques.
Let's focus on the four most common ones and understand why they are chosen. They all try to answer the question, who was on the critical path when the delay occurred?
Start with the most straightforward.
1. As planned versus as built, effect equals cause. This is the simplest comparison. You compare the initial planned schedule with the final actual schedule. It visually shows the difference between expectation and reality.
But it's not great for litigation.
It's often poor for litigation because it doesn't separate the causes clearly or account for whether the activities were truly critical. It's great for an overview, poor for legal proof.
Moving to something more theoretical.
Yeah.
2. As planned impacted. Cause effect.
Well, this is a purely hypothetical exercise. You take the initial planned program, insert only the employer-responsible delays, and run the schedule forward. The resulting new completion date determines what the extension of time should have been if those owner delays had been the only thing that happened.
So it's effective for establishing entitlement.
But it often fails in court because it ignores everything else that happened on the site: contractor inefficiency, force majeure events, and so on.
So that's theoretical proof of entitlement. What about the method that uses real-time updates?
3. Time impact, or time slices, or snapshot analysis, cause-effect. This is highly dynamic and often considered more defensible. You take snapshots of the delay's effect on the program at the time the event occurs, plotting the effect onto the updated in-progress schedule.
So if the owner causes a delay in month 3, you update the schedule to month 3, insert the delay, and see how the critical path shifts.
Exactly. This sounds much more accurate because it uses contemporaneous project data, reflecting the reality of the schedule at the moment of impact. Its weakness, though, lies in the nature of the snapshots. If the project schedule is only updated quarterly, major factors occurring between the observations might be missed or improperly analyzed.
And finally, the method that works backward from the truth. 4. As built, but for analysis. Effect is cause.
This is the ultimate forensic approach. It identifies the actual work sequence as it was built. You then extract the employer risk events, the owner-caused delays, from that as-built program. The analysis then shows how long the work would have taken, but for those owner-caused events.
And if the resulting but-for completion date is earlier than the actual date, that difference represents the delay specifically caused by the owner.
Exactly. This method is highly favored in litigation because it begins with the indisputable reality of what was actually built.
We have established entitlement to time and figured out the cause of the delay. The final step in this process is quantification, translating delay into damages.
When we talk about damages paid by a breaching party, we distinguish between two concepts. Compensatory damages are intended to put the victim back in the same monetary position they would have been in if the violation had not occurred.
This is about making the victim whole.
Right. So no one is making millions of extra dollars off of a claim. They are just recovering what they lost. Contracts are normally limited to these.
And the other type.
Punitive damages. These are used to punish the breaching party, not to compensate the victim. These are typically reserved for cases of gross negligence or malice and are rarely, if ever, included in standard construction contract remedies.
The primary mechanism for the owner to recover pre-estimated damages when the contractor is late is the liquidated damages clause, or LDs.
Liquidated damages are sums agreed upon in advance, arrived at by a good faith effort to estimate the actual damage that would probably ensue from the breach. They are legally recoverable as agreed damages if a breach occurs.
And they're typically used when determining the actual granular damages, like lost revenue for a specific building, would be impossible or impractical.
Exactly. The sources provide a common example for public bodies, often tying the penalty to a very small daily percentage of the contract value.
Something like 0.1% a day.
Yes, often structured as a penalty of 0.1%, or 1 part per thousand, of the value of the undelivered item for each day of delay. This cumulative penalty, however, shall not exceed a critical financial limit, typically 10% of the total contract price.
So that 10% ceiling acts as a hard cap on the contractor's liability for simple delay.
It does, but the public body doesn't have to wait for the penalty to hit 10% before they can act, correct?
That's a vital point. If the delay fundamentally affects the activities of the contract and the owner loses confidence, the public body may terminate the contract by giving advance notice, even if the penalty has not yet reached that 10% maximum. LDs do not prevent termination for default. There's also an important administrative safeguard. If the scope of work is reduced through a variation, the LD rate must also be reduced.
Yes, it must be proportionally revised to reflect the lower value of the remaining work. The calculation ensures fairness. If you omit 20% of the scope, the maximum penalty must be reduced by 20%.
Let's return to the contractor's claim. If they were hit by a compensable delay, their recoverable damages must be a direct consequence of the claim matter. What costs are in their claim package?
The claim package focuses on the costs of survival and continuation. This includes extended field costs, which means keeping the site running longer than planned. That's field office rent, site security, utilities, and temporary facilities. It also includes idle labor and equipment charges.
And the economic risks they bore during that extra time.
Yes, recovery for higher costs for materials, escalation, if inflation drove up prices during the delay period. They also claim increased bond costs, extended warranties, maintaining and protecting work during the delays, and potentially compensation for inefficiency caused by disruption.
But the most complicated cost, the one that requires a deep accounting dive, is the indirect cost, home office overhead.
Absolutely. When claiming costs associated with compensable delays, the recovery of costs associated with the head office, the centralized costs of running the business, the electricity for the CEO's office, the payroll department, must be accounted for.
And since you can't look at an invoice and say, this $100 of utility costs went solely to the delayed project X, legal precedent relies on formulas to allocate that overhead fairly.
It does.
This is the crux of many large claims. Because calculating actual HOO attribution is so complex, 3 court-sanctioned formulas exist: Hudson's, Emden's, and Eichley. We need to focus on the principle behind each one, not just the algebra.
Think of these as 3 different legally recognized ways to answer the question. What portion of the company's daily operational costs should this specific delayed project have been absorbing during the period of delay?
Let's start with the Hudson formula. What foundational assumption does it rely on?
The Hudson formula relies on the contractor's original budget assumption for that specific project. It asks, what percentage of this contract's price did we originally allocate to cover HOO and profit? It then converts that percentage into a daily or weekly recovery rate and applies it to the duration of the delay.
So the principle is that the project should recover based on its own planned profitability and overhead contribution.
That's it. Which makes sense if the original bid was accurate.
Okay, so how does Emden formula challenge that assumption?
Emden's is a two-stage approach that uses the overall company performance percentage as its baseline. It argues that relying on the specific project's budget might be unfair if that project was either over or underbid. So, stage one looks at the contractor's aggregate business.
The big picture.
Right. What percentage of the company's total revenue for that year went to covering overhead and profit across all jobs?
So it normalizes the overhead recovery across the entire portfolio.
Exactly. Stage two then applies that normalized company percentage to the contract price and duration of the delayed project. It ensures that the recovery rate reflects the contractor's general financial efficiency, not just the assumptions made on one bid.
And finally, the Eichle formula, which is perhaps the most famous, particularly in the U.S. What accounting question does Eichle specifically address?
Eichle is designed to determine the unabsorbed overhead when a project is delayed but not shut down, meaning the project is still consuming resources, but its ability to absorb overhead is impaired. The principle of the Eichle formula is to calculate what fraction of our company's total business was this specific delayed project.
How does it calculate that fraction?
It takes the project's total revenue and divides it by the total company revenue during the contract period. It then applies that ratio to the company's total overhead cost for that period.
So it ring-fences a portion of the total corporate overhead specifically for the delayed project.
It does. That ring-fenced amount is then divided by the actual duration of the project, including the delay, to get a daily overhead absorption rate, which is then multiplied by the number of delayed days. It's a very rigorous way to allocate a fair share of corporate cost to a job that has unexpectedly dragged on.
We end with the ultimate measure of failure, contract termination. The sources provide mathematical frameworks for calculating the final damages. Let's look first at termination by the employer when the contractor is not at fault.
This usually happens for convenience or due to frustration. The formula for the amount payable to or by the contractor seeks to balance all expenditures against the original agreed price. Conceptually, the calculation looks at what the contractor has been paid already, subtracts the expenses the owner incurred in completing the unfinished work, and accounts for any losses or damages caused by the contractor for which they are liable.
And it balances that against the total amount that would have been payable had the project been completed.
Yes. It's a cleanup calculation, ensuring the contractor is paid fairly for the work performed up to the termination date, plus any demobilization costs, minus what it cost the owner to finish the job.
Now for the flip side. When the works are abandoned after termination by the employer due to the contractor's default, insolvency, or corruption, this is a breach situation.
Here, the formula is structurally similar but includes variables that account for the contractor's default costs. The core principle here is calculating what the owner must spend to fix the mess and complete the job, ensuring the owner is made whole first. The defaulting contractor may be left owing the difference if the cost to complete exceeds the original contract value.
So what does this all mean? We've moved from the simple concept of a change, the owner wanting something different, to the complex financial forensics of the Hudson, Emden, and Eichle formulas. The journey shows us that planning for change is not an afterthought, it is a critical, formalized part of project success, driven by the need to allocate risk fairly.
Precisely. What stands out here is the level of procedural detail required to turn an unexpected event, like discovering unforeseen soil conditions, into a justifiable time extension or a compensable monetary claim. Failure to follow the strict rules of engagement, like missing that 48-hour notification window, can instantly nullify your entitlement.
So being correct on the facts is only half the battle.
Timely documentation is the other half.
To summarize for you, we cover the types of changes, from minor to the catastrophic cardinal change, the crucial categories of delays, separating excusable time only from compensable time and money, and we dove into the intricate court-sanctioned calculation methods used to prove monetary damages for extended overhead, focusing on the core principles behind Hudson, Emden, and Eichle.
And remember that uncertainty is defined as an information gap. The highest level of project management mastery involves minimizing that gap, either by getting the information earlier or by structuring the contract to transfer the risk away from your team.
Here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. The construction industry accepts change as inevitable, meticulously managing it through the four interventions: absorption, splitting, postponing, or transfer. If critical thinking involves questioning assumptions, then the highest level of mastery in contract management might be achieving an acceleration without officially claiming one, simply by mitigating all uncertainties before they ever become formal, cost-inducing delays. What systems in your own field, whether corporate strategy, government policy, or personal goal setting, could benefit from treating uncertainty not as a risk to be avoided, but as information lacking, which can be mitigated by these four formalized actions?